I'm going to just turn to the panel if members don't have any initial questions. On the first staff recommendation, the language identified under WRP1 on compliance with existing state law on adoption of rate structures that promote water-efficient practices and conservation as part of WRP1. Comments? Ms. Hoffman-Fleury.
Chairman Eisenberg, thank you. Right now, as written, I can't comment on the language. It looks like it was in an earlier version, and
it was in the fourth, fifth, and fifth. It just got dropped.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to comment on the new language, but DWR just has some questions about what the council's thought is about this particular issue. You have my comments in front of you, but let me read it anyway. This particular provision requires water suppliers to reduce reliance on the Delta by a significant reduction in net water use or in the percentage of water used from the Delta watershed. One way of doing this is for water suppliers to show they're complying with the laws regarding water conservation, water efficiency, and urban and ag water management planning. DWR exports or transports water from the Delta, but we are essentially not a water supplier. The state water contractor, the state water project contractors and their members are water suppliers, but they do not export water from the Delta, with a couple of minor exceptions. So our question to you is, does this mean that the council does not consider this policy to apply to DWR exports or transfers?
Oh, are you asking whether we believe that the state of California should include conservation pricing mechanism when it sells water? Is that the question you wish us to answer?
No, I'm trying to determine if you're seeing this as applied to a water exporter. We are just the exporter. We're not the water supplier in this particular case.
I understand the legal distinction. Is not water conservation pricing part of required Urban Water Management Act?
I believe it is.
But Department of Water Resources would not like to be inadvertently included within the masses of water agencies that must meet that law?
Well,
I'm just asking.
We do require urban water management plans now, and we review those and make determinations as to whether they say that they're going to comply, and
right.
that's as far as we go. We're not the enforcement entity here to ensure that they're doing everything that they tell us that they're doing. So it puts us in a bit of an awkward position.
We're not the enforcement agency to require that they're doing what they're required to do. Who is?
We are assuming that they're doing the things that they say that they're doing.
Mr. Chair, can I respond to that
Sure.
question? The intent of the policy is clearly that the parties who are exporting the water, who are taking delivery of the water out of the Delta, need to comply with the Act. The principal times when they might have covered actions that would come before the council or where they would have to certify compliance with the Delta plan would be when they, A, renew contracts with DWR or do transfers, long-term transfers through the Delta. In both those cases, if they're taking water that's caused by their failure to implement these best management practices, let's call them,
Okay.
when that causes a big problem or is a significant impact on the co-equal goals, then yes, they have to be consistent with it. And maybe our vernacular needs to change so that it says parties that take delivery of water out of the Delta instead of saying exporters. But that was the vernacular. And I think most people have understood that that's what we were aiming at. As I understand, actually, the law, DWR itself, is exempt from those provisions of the law requiring urban water management plans and even the provisions of 7X7 in terms of the 20% by 2020, because the law intended that the parties that actually take delivery of the water and use it had to meet those standards. So if there is a language problem, a legal language problem, then I'll ask our attorney to look at that.
Yeah, we'd be happy.
Mr. Stevens?
This language has been out there, I believe, and I'm looking to Martha as well over there and Gwen. The definition of water suppliers we've had in our drafts, at least now 2 or 3 drafts. And this is the first time DWR has brought up the issue. But as Joe points out, if you have technical legal changes that you think can add to the clarity, we'd be happy to take a look at that. I think, Joe, you accurately stated what this policy is about. This policy is about jurisdiction over covered actions. Covered actions have a definition, and what we're focusing in on are water suppliers that actually receive the water, and whether or not they're doing the things that they should be doing, and if they're not doing the things that they should be doing and are causing the need for the covered action, then it may be inconsistent with our Delta plan. So if there's a tweak that we need to do in the definition of water supplier, I think I actually defer to our water management experts over there. We'll take a look at it. But
Mr.
I think
Nordhoff,
the policy's been the same for a while.
Mr. Nordhoff, you were leaning forward like you wanted to say something.
I'll pass.
Okay. All right. I don't mind answering the legal question, but it's startling to hear the Department of Water Resources say that you are not the agency responsible for seeing that local agencies comply with the urban water management plans. That is a dramatic statement. So we have a law that no agency is in charge of, no penalties for violation. Everyone says they're doing the best they can, and that's okay.
Well, I think that we do discuss with the different water agencies the kinds of things that they're doing, but I don't know that I would say that we are, the enforcer of those specific actions. We encourage them to do those. They're in their water management plans, but that's what we do.
Mr. Stevens.
I was going to say, thus the need for the Delta Reform Act and the Delta Plan, which actually does require these things.
Right.
Yeah.
And when we provide money through grant programs, we do have a checklist of things that they must show that they're in compliance with before we provide funding to them. So I guess that's
And it's
that's one
conservation
way.
Pricing and no methods are on the list?
I can't say that conservation pricing is, but potentially it might be. I'm not that intimately
I
familiar
think
with them.
consistency with that law is on the list, and that law has just taken effect. So
And
Yeah, even agricultural districts have quantity measurement as one of the
Right.
desired features under the Agricultural
correct.
Water Management Act. Mr. Zuckerman.
One of our long-term problems that we've addressed many times is the way the DWR perceives of its role in this whole process. And if you read the Water Code, they have stewardship responsibilities for the resources of the state of California, water resources and so forth. If they simply take the position that they're exporting water from the Delta and are not required or not responsible for enforcing the laws that relate to the stewardship of these things, I think it falls right into the box that we've been criticizing them for. I don't see how you can say that the agency that's responsible for exporting the water is not also an agency to make sure that the people who are receiving that water are in compliance with the law and policy of the state.
can I defend DWR here? DWR
Thanks, Joe.
has multiple mandates, and I think does an outstanding job meeting the requirements of the law, given that there are challenges with the way the law is written and holes in where the law is at, and also holes in funding to do things. I'm sure, at least I remember from my time there were many things the department would have loved to be able to do, but simply didn't have the money to do it. And some of them involved managing the resources of the state better. So while I will stand up and say absolutely that we need to do these things, I want to be careful about saying negative things about an agency.
Can I make
Thanks, Joe.
a
Ms.
note?
Marcus.
And I don't know where to put this in. I mean, one of my overall thoughts in this is then looking at our suite of recommendations is that we've gone pretty light on recommending what the governor and the legislature should do in terms of adequately resourcing certain efforts. I mean, I think it's because we've had to spend so much time on the drafts of the plan that we should have a set of those kinds of recommendations as well, as opposed to being silent on it. I mean, there are things that all the agencies we're asking them to do that they don't do out of capacity or because the law doesn't really make them do it. I mean, and we're silent there in large part. So I would really appreciate it if the staff would do sort of take a breath and do a sweep through the recommendations for what we should be recommending the governor and the legislature do specifically. There are some places where I saw it, but not very many. And that would deal with this particular issue.
Yeah, I mean, I just say if the department's position is they have a duty to encourage cooperation but not require cooperation, that perhaps the law should be changed. It wouldn't make your job any easier, but it would mean that someone in state government has a responsibility to see that conservation and system efficiencies, which are how the state water plan update for the last 3 cycles has identified most water supplies are going to be found in the near future.
Sure.
I mean, how can you not take this stuff seriously if that's where you expect to find most water? I understand the politics of it is tough, but geez, the management views in water resources have been consistent for as long as I've been looking at those plans, that's where the future is. They're not a gigantic pool of water sitting around that nobody knows about that you can magically draw on whenever you want it.
Sure. And let me backtrack a little. I didn't mean to imply that we don't pay attention to folks out there when they're doing their water management activities. But when I mentioned the grant programs, we have some very strict guidelines on which they have to fulfill different mandates, if you will, before we provide funding to them. And a lot of that, the guidelines that are developed and then the PSPs that are developed to encourage folks to apply for grant funding, they have to meet those strict standards. There's environmental stewardship activities, there's water conservation, that's reduced reliance on the delta waters. There's a whole host of things, so it's not like we're not paying attention to it. There are requirements, and but if they say that their water district is 80% efficient, we don't go out and count up how they got to that 80% efficiency. When I say we're not an enforcer, we don't have a hat and a badge and a gun that goes out and makes sure that they are doing exactly as they say they're doing, either in their water management plan or when they're applying to grants. We are assuming that this is a good faith effort on their part. I mean, surely blatant things we're going to figure out in a short period of time, but we don't go out, don't have the staff, the ability to go out and do that kind of detail level of enforcement. That's really what I was implying.
Mr. Rentz, then Mr. Zlotnick.
Thank you, Mr. Eisenberg. I want to bring us back to a little more fundamental question that ties into our concern with WRP1. And it starts with the section in the Water Code that provides the authority for the policy, and that's 85021. 85021 provides the policy of the state of California is to reduce reliance on the Delta in meeting California's future water supplies needs through a statewide strategy of investing in improved regional supplies, conservation, and water use efficiency. Each region that depends on water from the Delta watershed shall improve its regional self-reliance. And it goes on and gives examples of that. Our concern is that there's a misinterpretation of 85021 that's reflected in WRP1. If you look at the first sentence on WRP1, page 100, beginning on line 16, it says, a proposed action is inconsistent with the Delta Plan if one or more water suppliers that would receive water as a result. Nowhere in 85021 do we see the reference to a singular agency. We would encourage the council to direct staff to rewrite WRP1 and maybe even consider it as a recommendation, but that's another discussion, to reflect what the intent of 85021 was, which is regional efforts to reduce regional self-reliance as opposed to focusing on individual agencies. Second issue we have that we on our WRP1 starts on line 23 on page 100, and it is a concern for us too, is when it starts talking about how you're going to determine whether there was a reduced reliance. Again, as this section, this policy line is written, I'm assuming it's interpreted as individual agencies, but it can also look at areas, I guess. It says, quote, reducing reliance on the delta and adequately contributing to improved regional self-reliance, end of quote, means a significant reduction in net water use or in the percentage of water used from the delta watershed. Problem we have with that is it needs to be recognized that there are areas in the delta, below the delta, that are totally dependent on delta water, and we do not know how you anticipate imposing, how you can reasonably impose that on those type of areas. So we'd encourage you to take a look at that as you revisit WRP1. So in conclusion, what we'd encourage you to do is ask staff to rewrite this WRP1 to be consistent with 85021. Thank you.
A strained reading of a code section, in my opinion, Mr. Rentz.
That's what lawyers do.
Mr.
They read differently.
I will concur with most of what Mr. Rentz said, and I will not rehash for your direction and Mr. Johnston's the arguments about the role of 85021 in the plan, which we've provided many times before. However, with respect to the specific policy and sort of consistent with what Mark described, we do have proposed language changes, which I think a number of you have seen. If you haven't, I have copies.
Are they in the latest letters?
They are in our letters also that we submitted. And basically it sort of gets to the couple of issues. The one is the notion of proposed versus covered action. It should be a covered action, not the proposed action, because that's what your regulation deals with, are covered actions. The issue of regions is an important one in dealing with the issue of wholesalers versus individual agencies is reached through a regional approach. Just sort of the discussion down below in the third paragraph of the current policy, we just tighten it up and are very clear that compliance with state law is what you're looking for in this. We would, in terms of order of preference, we would recommend just deleting the policy altogether. We know that's not going to happen in all likelihood. We would then suggest that you change it to a recommendation. And in terms of actually figuring out what's going on out in the hustings, so to speak, ask for a report that says, who's doing what, and is this really a necessary issue to focus on with regulation or not. And then, because as you know, you're not going away, and you get to come back and you can revisit this and say, well, is it really a problem or not? And we can be a little more surgical in how we approach the issue in that sense. And so we would suggest that as well. And we'll leave it at that so I don't get into it with the chairman.
Okay. Mr. Bobker, then Mr. Zuckerman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, my comment is along the same lines, although perhaps in a different direction than Mr. Zlotman, Mr. Lentz's. But my question to you is that sort of gets to the deeper underlying issues of the section that we're talking about, rather than the specific open issue the staff has raised. So just, is it your pleasure to only confine it to the open issue, or to continue to allow the larger?
Say something about the open issue and then drift into the larger discussion everybody else has.
I will obey your directive on mission creep, or however we want to call that.
Comment creep.
Yes, regarding the open issues, we support the proposed staff change. I think it was inadvertent admission, and it is correct to put it back in. It is an important tool to achieving the policy that is described in this section, which we think should be retained as a policy. But let me get to a bigger underlying point, which is that we think you need to tighten the definition of what the policy of reducing reliance on the delta means here. And it really comes down to one word, and that word is "and."
That is.
Give me the reference on the line, page.
Yes. So if you look at using this language, the language in front of us here, the purposes of this policy in that third paragraph, for the purposes of this policy, reducing reliance on the delta and adequately contributing to improved regional self-reliance means a significant reduction in net water use or in the percentage of water used, et cetera, et cetera. So the word "and" the word "or" represent very different choices. And you have the word "or" here, and I strongly recommend that it should be the word "and." And the reason for that is that there are two benefits that we're looking for here. One is a reduction in net use because the delta is an overstressed, overallocated system, and we need to reduce the net use in a way that improves environmental and other values. At the same time, we need to, in areas that use water from the delta, diversifying water supplies is a great thing. We want to, increases the resilience and adequacy of their supplies. But if you have a choice between the two, and you choose to reduce the percentage of water used from the delta, well, in fact, you can use it to offset increases in demand, increases in use, without actually ever contributing to solving the problem in the delta. So you may indeed meet an important goal, which is protecting your local water supply and increasing your self-reliance, and that is a good thing. But I believe the primary purpose of this plan is not to enforce statewide policy. It is actually to achieve the state's purposes in the delta. And so I believe the primary purpose here is to reduce the net use. So I would say both are important, and we would recommend strongly that you consider the word "and" instead of the word "or."
Do you want reaction?
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Zuckerman. Excuse me. I'm sorry.
From our perspective, this is the guts of the whole plan. And what I hear in this conversation is you have this policy which the legislature has directed you to implement. The Department of Water Resources doesn't want to police it. The recipients don't want individual agencies to be responsible. So you have, in effect, no tools for implementing the policy if you follow these directives or these requests. And I think if you lose this, you've lost the tool for dealing with the gross overallocation of the natural resources of the rivers of Northern California. So hang on to it, otherwise your plan is going to be relatively meaningless.
Randy.
Tom, how is a grower in the Delta who's producing oats and corn in any given year going to meet this objective of reducing a reliance on the Delta?
I'm not sure that was the intent of this, but we are, willing at any time to come forward and demonstrate that we are making efficient use of the water resources that are available to us. And I think that's really the response to the problem. To the extent that there is waste or unreasonable use, I think we're responsible, along with everybody else in the state, for correcting that.
I think somebody in Butte County, Stanislaus County, Kern County, Fresno County would argue the same thing, at least from an agriculture point of view. So it's difficult for me to sit here and ask or to expect that areas that are entirely dependent upon the Delta right now and in areas outside of the Delta that are in a groundwater overdraft situation to comply with the strictest interpretation of this policy. And
well, then they probably ought to go out of production.
Well, that is an economic choice. And I guess those that are in an area where they have those difficulties are trying to make business decisions and are looking to this body to try and help provide a more reliable water supply for not just California, but for their area too.
I'm not aware that there's any area of the state that doesn't have opportunities to wean themselves off the Delta supply in meaningful ways. And
well, I would suggest that the Delta itself would be in that an example of an area that cannot wean itself off the supplies of Delta water. It's just inherently that's your water source.
Well, it certainly is incumbent upon us to make reasonable, non-wasteful uses of that water. And to the extent that there are opportunities to do so, I'm sure we would be happy to do it. But it has to be, limited by some sense of reasonableness. And if you can make a showing that there is absolutely no other way of dealing with it, such as replenishing the groundwater in wet years, doing conjunctive use programs, doing conservation, doing recycling and so forth within your area, then I suppose you're in the same position that we are in the Delta.
And I think that what you raise is what I think ought to be included in the narrative, at least for WRP1, and that are some examples for agencies that are in between a rock and a hard spot, and give them some assurance that they're not going to be forced out of business because of this policy, and that there would be some reasonableness applied to this based on not only previous investments for water conservation and efficiency, but also for those steps that they would take in the future that may not reduce their net use of Delta water. I think examples, just as you've suggested, would be a good inclusion for this policy.
And I think that's what staff recommends, is that we include examples to clarify this. I think the fears of people that the council would be extreme are just that, fears that are not well justified. I do think that there are things that people can do. I want to note that in 2010, the legislature actually had a trailer bill that required that grants from DWR and their integrated regional water management program that everyone, the watershed, everyone that got those grants demonstrate reduced dependence on the Delta. And it didn't stop anybody from submitting grants, and they all had part of their plan how they could reduce their dependence on the Delta. My belief is they can do that, and we ought to use examples like that in this to clarify what was intended. I don't think anybody intended in the legislature that it be the extreme interpretation that somebody that's farming in the Delta and is perfectly efficient is not eligible because they can't do anything to reduce. So I think I agree with the vice chair. And that if you guys don't tell me something different, that's what I would propose that staff do.
Mr. Machado.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think one must be careful in the examples, that the examples themselves do not distort the application of market forces that cause behavioral changes. And the price of water can influence a grower and the type of crops they raise, and it's usually associated with the return expected for the amount invested. Reduced reliance on the Delta is essential to the economic sustainability of the Delta for a variety of reasons. But I would hope that the Council, in looking at the examples, would caution that the examples themselves don't preclude the applicable market forces that would cause change to take place that would be responsive to a reduction in the use of water.
Mr. Nordhoff.
I would agree. Is this thing working? With Mr. Grunstadt's recommendation that we accept the staff's recommendation. But before we leave this, I'm a neophyte at this. I don't know. I don't have much experience here. But my impression of the Department of Water Resources is that it doesn't go out proactively and get data. It collects data It doesn't do anything to verify those data to see if they're accurate or not. It doesn't make any reports from those data. And if those data indicate that somebody is doing something they shouldn't, there's no enforcement. If that's true, what does it do?
Yeah.
Well, we have a lot of different mandates, and we have flood control, flood management responsibilities. We have safety of dam responsibilities. We operate the State Water Project. We do a lot of different things. We have grant programs through our integrated water management programs, regional water management programs. We have a water conservation department or a division that identifies and reviews these urban water management plans. We put forth regulations related to agricultural water management plans. I could probably go on for a long time.
Is most of that reactive as opposed to proactive?
No, I would say there's a lot of both there. I mean, we have mandates to do a lot of different things, but there's only so much staff that can put forth, effort into not necessarily quantifying, but ensuring that the mandates are actually happening or being done out in the field. We don't have the staff to go out and check on every urban water management entity and determine whether they are doing everything that they said they would do. I mentioned already that when folks apply for grants, we do a lot of grant programs in a lot of different areas, urban streams, water management, regional water management activities. We have to rely on the submitters of those grants to identify to us, tell us exactly what they've done to reduce their reliance on Delta water, to do water conservation, water recycling. I think that there's multiple tier pricing activities that we've done in the past. I think we're still doing some. But we do not have the staff, the time to go out and ensure that every one of those things is being done to the degree and level that.
I wouldn't argue with that, but do you have people to go out and spot check?
I can't answer that. I don't know.
I mean, we had a great governor of California went on to become a great president who, in dealing with the Russians, said trust but verify. And you don't have to verify everything, but you can at least send some people out, do some spot checks so that people are concerned that maybe they will be one of the ones checked.
Point?
Pat?
In this policy, I wanted to probe the issue of region, which I think, Mark, you cited at the beginning. The question of whether the policy ought to apply to one or more water suppliers or should apply to a region. What would be an example of a water supplier not being able to comply with this policy, but the region complying with it? If that's the problem being raised or being proposed to be solved by change in language?
That's a good question, Mr. Johnston. I can't give you a specific example, but if I could, I can give you a hypothetical.
A hypothetical.
Okay. Hypothetical situation. Look at integrated regional water management plans. Often involve numerous water agencies. As part of that negotiation and development of the plan, you look at the individual agencies within that area and determine what their water needs are, what their water supplies are, and what their water portfolio is. You might find that one agency cannot reduce its individual reliance, but the region, in its planning mechanism, in developing a broader portfolio, recycled water, better use of storm water, conservation, water use efficiency, the region as a whole, and that was what we believe was the intent of the of the legislation, and it reflected in 85021, the region as a whole, and we support that, develops ways over time that it increases its portfolio. It's to their advantage. But
so do you think that potentially that issue is relevant in Kern, in Westlands, in Metropolitan, in Santa Clara? Where?
I think it is incumbent as we move ahead that we look everywhere and look at ways, and we said it in our comment, look at ways, and we concur with the part in there of how do you improve your portfolio, use your water efficiency. That's going to be incumbent in everywhere in the region as we face more and more challenges as we go forward together, whether it's climate change, environmental issues that compete for the same water. We're all going to have to look at that. But our concern is the application of this WRP1, as I understand, is in the context of looking at covered actions and consistency with the Delta Plan. And one agency within a region could, as I guess somebody could interpret it, could override the consistency determination, whereas the region as a whole is making an effort. There are, as Mr. Fiorini pointed out, there are areas both within the Delta but also outside the Delta where they are 100% reliant on Delta water. What do you turn to those agencies or regions and say to them?
So what would be an example of that?
Mojave is an example that I've been told where they're almost completely reliant on. So
So what regional entity would comply with this policy if Mojave, a district,
I honestly, geographically, I couldn't answer that question for you right now. Be glad to get to you. Greg may understand.
Pat, I don't have an example in terms of Mojave, but your general question, I mean, it's twofold. One, in terms of, for example, let's say a member agency of Metropolitan, for some reason, either doesn't have the technical capability, the financial capability, whatever, to deal with this. It may be a small agency. When Metropolitan comes to undertake a transfer, that is the covered action, as I understand the policy. Metropolitan is undertaking a transfer.
Okay, so
then you look at who's receiving the water. Well,
how many districts are there roughly in Metropolitan?
Is it 24?
So is the issue you raised, taking Metropolitan as an example, is that Metropolitan wants to transfer water, and one of these or two or some subset of the entirety of water districts can't individually meet this standard, and it's your view that therefore Metropolitan would be in violation of this policy?
Under this, they're the entity undertaking the covered action.
Joe, is that right?
I think that's why we want to put examples. I don't think that, in fact, that would be the case. When you read the policy, it says specifically that the failure has significantly caused the need for the proposed action. So if one or two or five of Metropolitan's agencies hadn't complied, Metropolitan, under this policy, could still move ahead. And I think we can address the regional issue.
Actually, Joe, I'm not comfortable with examples.
Okay.
I'd like to know what the policy is. So if we take Metropolitan as the example, what does Metropolitan have to do to comply with this? And does the policy require a majority, 2/3, 90%, or all of its
well, in fact, what it does is it requires Metropolitan itself.
Right, Metropolitan itself. But since it's a wholesaler,
it can still implement things.
Do all of the districts that it sells water to have to comply? Because eventually, some of those districts are going to receive the water that creates the proposed action.
Right, but Metropolitan, I think, and Martha's the expert on this, but my belief is that Metropolitan can comply no matter what those agencies do, because in the end, Metropolitan controls the water rates for the water that it sells. It controls the ability to do conservation measures to implement those things. It controls the ability to store water conjunctively, so it controls the ability to obtain other water sources. So I think that Metropolitan, on its own, irrespective of what their sub-agencies do, could comply with this policy.
Let me shift, Tom, in the Delta, and I know it's not the same situation, but how would you read this language for South Delta or Central Delta or North Delta? Do you believe that every island reclamation district must comply with this individually, or can there be a regional compliance?
Well, I think compliance becomes an issue when you're proposing to do something different than you're doing today. And it's not, it doesn't, you don't have to go out and do something today if you're not seeking to do something else. And it's unlikely that in most instances we'll be doing anything different in the Delta than we're doing today. So it's not likely to come up. The second point, which I should have responded to Mr. Fiorini, is that there's a whole fabric of water rights and preferences and so forth that were set up in order to assure the Delta, which was relying upon a natural supply there, that it would be protected against over consumption, over export, over use of the water supply. But if some entity within the district, let's say the city of Stockton, decided it wanted to have a second water supply out of the Delta or something, I presume it would have to come in and as part of the regulatory process of getting a permit and so forth, would have to satisfy this criteria. In terms of what current use is without meaningful change in any of it, I don't suppose the policy would apply.
I'd like to take up your question.
Say that again. If City of Stockton, which is just completing a major project, right, to take Delta water and treat it, if it decided to do another such project, you said you don't think this current draft of the policy would affect the city?
Not its current project, because that's...
No, not the current project. That's already done.
I think
if it did a similar one in the future.
No, I think it probably would.
Uh-huh.
Or any major change in the use and distribution of water by any of the entities that deal with the Delta.
Ms. Gray.
I want to kind of go back to what Pat was saying. Why is it that we cannot use the language region? If there's questions about the intent of this policy, it is not quite clear as to what it really means. And I know Joe indicated he wanted to give examples, and I don't think everything can fall into an example. Why can't we be clear? Why can't we use the word region?
Frankly, if we use the word region, I would be tempted to define it specifically as all 29 contractors for the State Water Project and all of the contractors for the CVP. I think it's a red herring. The truth is, every agency that exports out of the Delta should be covered by this policy. And to pretend that, oh, this is terrible because it says single agency, the agencies that export generally are, in fact, regional agencies. Mojave has a bunch of sub-agencies. Metropolitan has a bunch of sub-agencies. When they do integrated regional plans, they do it as if they are a region. So I think that's a red herring. The truth is, when somebody does a transfer, they ought to comply with this policy. Sorry.
Well, just I'm sorry, I'm running over Gloria's statement, but it's on the same point. Joe, if that's the case, then I don't understand the wording. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but it says a proposed action is inconsistent with the Delta Plan if one or more of the water suppliers that would receive water as a result of the proposed action. So, I mean,
But if you're
it's
doing a
the-
proposed action, you could have 3 or 4 purveyors that are part of a contract to take water out.
Well, sure. But it doesn't, the way I read it is, your example is Metropolitan is a state contractor, right?
They are.
So it has a proposal to take more water. It's subject to this, that's clear. But there are a lot of smaller agencies that are beneficiaries of that water. The way this reads is they would receive the water. So therefore, as the end users of the water, their receipt of the water makes them subject to the covered action. And I didn't hear you saying that's what it was.
I'm going to defer to
Well, it's not a matter of deference, but I'll try to explain what my understanding of the language is. First of all, I think there's a fundamental point with regard to this policy and what I've heard people say here on the panel, but also in the past, with regard to the authority for the policy. You know, where in the Delta Reform Act is the genesis? What can you point to as authority? And if it's 85021, you're completely misinterpreting what 85021 talks about, where we've heard about regional versus a singular or one or more water suppliers. 85021 isn't the only authority for this. In fact, we had a public letter that we put out many months ago that was an attachment to a letter that you sent, Joe, to Jerry Merrill and I believe Secretary Laird, that explained what our authority was with regard to this policy, because this policy has been discussed for many, many months now. The Delta Reform Act has other references and, in fact, mandates to include measures in the Delta Plan that promote statewide water conservation, water use efficiency.
Chris,
Yeah.
I don't disagree with any of that.
Well, no,
I just want to know who to hold accountable, and if it's all the water contractors, let's do that.
We are, and I was getting to that. But I think it's fundamental that, first of all, that we're not just focusing on 85021, but 85021 is one of the major statutory authority references. So we'll go on record as saying that. With regard to the policy, it does say a proposed action, and it talks about the types of proposed actions. But you're right, it talks about water suppliers that receive water from the proposed action. So the proposed action, be it a water transfer, a water export facility, whatever it is, within the boundaries of whatever the CEQA review would be, you have to describe what the project is. You have to describe where the water's coming from, who the water's going to. That's the project that we're talking about. So if you're transferring water, if it's a metropolitan project, there are other water suppliers that we're talking about. If those water suppliers are scofflaws, so to speak, they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they're causing the need for the metropolitan proposed covered action, then the proposed covered action would be inconsistent. It's not the case that metropolitan can go ahead necessarily if the description of the project includes giving water to other agencies. So it's a matter of defining what the project is. If it's a covered action, you look at that covered action. If it's significantly caused by some of the water suppliers that are receiving that water not doing what they should be doing, then the covered action would be inconsistent with the Delta Plan.
Okay, then it is the intent of the policy to reach to all the beneficiaries, all the districts.
The intent of the policy is to reach to the people who are receiving water from the covered action.
So sometimes District X, which could be a sub-agency for any other agency that moves water through the Delta, is the principal sponsor of a transfer. So the transfer involves one or two or three other entities who are, I'll call them sub-agencies of the entity doing the transfer. So when you're doing that kind of a transaction, you need to be able to look at all of the entities and whether they are, and obviously you could hold the entity that has to be involved in the transfer accountable, but we think that it's useful to also say, hey, if you're going to do this, you need to be following the rules.
I just make a note. Footnote 18 which is worth, since we're talking about that language, defines water suppliers as urban water suppliers and agricultural water suppliers. And in the next sentence, it defines urban water suppliers as both retail and wholesale. And that definition used to be in the text of the narrative. It's been made a footnote. I just want to make a generic comment. The reason we're serious about this is because this is one of the few serious provisions in the Delta Plan, the one that actually deals with real problems. 18 months ago, Ms. Gray showed up at a meeting and told us that her water district had just adopted a policy setting a reduced reliance through conservation and efficiencies of, God save me, 40% or something like that at a couple decades out.
Right, 2020.
And in fairness, and I think you actually asked this question, if we are doing that, what is everybody else doing to help make the state work? And that's really the question that's here. The legislation, the decreased reliance language, as Tom said, is at the heart of this issue because it attempts to address the practical problems of exporting water when the Delta environment is being harmed simultaneously and tries to solve it and see some way forward. And it references what are constitutional provisions that no person in California can use water except for beneficial purposes. They must use water reasonably, and they cannot waste it. And that's a law that covers everybody, and it supersedes everything else. You can't, just because you have a water right somewhere doesn't mean you can violate the Constitution. Now, that's why this approach, complicated as it is one of the things that offers some limited opportunity. I think that's Tom's view. A limited opportunity to get past the deadlock we found ourselves in for all these years. But it requires that all of us pony up that we have an obligation to follow the Constitution. And all of us engage in conservation. The plan does not say what the percent will be. The plan does not say that every water district must meet the same water requirement district of Gloria Gray whenever she's chairing her water district. Could, but it doesn't say that. And the notion that somewhere in state government, and this is after all a state plan, there's supposed to be an agency that talks about the current laws that impose a requirement on districts to plan for this activity is serious stuff. Seems to me to be pretty important. So, I mean, nothing's without problems. But this is one of the few things that is slightly different from all the old water debate and offers, in my judgment, some hope of resolving problems for all of us in California in the future. There is no way that we can add population and see our economy grow and assume that a finite water supply allows everybody to use water exactly the way they want to, anytime they want to. That's what the National Academy report was all about. I thought it was worth talking about. This is fundamental stuff to me. Randy, then Gloria, then Hank.
Joe, back to the request for examples. Let me pose a question for either you or Chris. We know we have significant water quality problems in the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, and there are numerous small communities, rural communities, sometimes referred to as disadvantaged communities, that are facing arsenic and nitrate problems in their groundwater, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. It would seem logical, just from a 30,000-foot view, that some of these communities could connect to a Central Valley or a state water project to find good quality water. Would this policy prohibit them from pursuing that request or that application?
I don't think so.
And where do you find it in what provision in the policy would exempt them from this policy?
Okay, their request to connect to the state project they would have to assume that they didn't reduce their reliance on the Delta, but that failure would have to have a significant adverse environmental impact in the Delta. In almost every case, doing something like that would mean you're taking water from one use and converting it to a different use. It doesn't mean there's more water being taken out of the delta. What it does mean is that you're taking water that may be used for agriculture now, using that for urban supply, and using the poorer quality water for the agricultural water supply. So on the face of it, it does not seem to me that it rises to the level of being a standard or a covered action. Now, if Fresno were suddenly to say we're going to take 300,000 acre feet out of the delta because our water quality is really poor, maybe you'd have, maybe that would become a covered action because it could have a significant impact and change, significant adverse impact on the delta. But you're talking about tiny communities, in this case, that are each going to take hundreds at most, maybe 1,000 acre feet. That's de minimis and would nowhere not come close to being a covered action.
So it's the significant adverse environmental impact provision that would allow them access to that water.
Yeah, I think that at the very least.
Yeah, I don't even think it would be a covered action. But.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be a covered action.
It's only a covered action if you meet those 4 statutory tests and are not other, and there's no, unless you're covered with an exclusion.
Well, the reason I posed the question, this would be a new use. This would be in an area that heretofore, or a customer that heretofore has not used water from the delta that's been entirely dependent upon groundwater.
And I could even think of other uses. If there is a proposed new city, you could call it a new city, new development down in the valley. If somebody is going to do that, my assumption is probably that contract to get that water is not going to be with the delta and not going to occur in the delta. It's likely to be between one of the agencies that has water rights and has determined these are surplus to our needs, or we're going to stop using this water so we can do this other development.
Gloria.
Thank you. We've had a lot of discussion on this particular policy, and I think someone said this is the guts of the plan. So it's obvious that this is very important to everyone. And I suggest that there was some language that was proposed by Mark and I believe Greg relative to this policy. I'd like to see it as an option that we can further discuss it when we come back to look at all the other options. I know staff has done a great job, and all due respect to Joe and staff, but I do think we should look at other options when the council makes a decision on this, because obviously we all are very passionate about this portion of the plan because it is the essence of the plan. And so I'd like to request staff to look at that language that's being proposed from the panelists and let the council actually talk about it again when we make the decision about what should be included. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Machado, Mr. Zlotnick, Mr. Randall. Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Mark. Excuse me. I'm sorry, Hank, I apologize. Wait, let me get Mr. Nordhoff, then Ms. Mark. Ms. Marcus, you're first.
All right. I have a lot of comments on this chapter, and I'm going to save them, but I want to go back to something we didn't run to ground. And I'm not, hopefully it'll clarify what Gloria and others are saying. I mean, this issue of the language of a region as opposed to one or more water suppliers that people have raised, I still want to understand it. I understand where people say that maybe giving examples isn't enough, but I do think it was helpful to have you say what you said, and I'm not sure that examples, or maybe a footnote, if it's clear enough, can classify it. I think one of the concerns is, let me see if I understood what you and Phil and others were saying. I mean, I was going to ask people for comfort language, which is coming from my Superfund toxics background, which is what language gives people comfort that it's not going to be the extreme of what they're worried about. As you know, I do agree that the guts of the plan and the guts of what the legislature wanted us to do, and what we have to do as a state is to figure out how to maximize conservation, reclamation, low-impact development, everything that will make us thrive and be able to use our water more efficiently. And there's a long way to go. I'm also convinced that every region's different, which is something that Randy raised, early on. And I do think, and I have suggestions for you, there are ways, in addition to the very nice box that can illustrate even further the differences between regions. So in that case, I do think more examples, although you can't be exhausted, is better than fewer. And I applaud you and your staff for responding to that concern. I just want to suggest, as I do in a lot of places, that we do more. But help me understand what happens in a particular circumstance. So let's just use this. Let's say we have Met. And Met is going for a project that rises to the level of a covered action. And one of their member agencies, or two, are not doing anything. Let's call them the babbled out district, for lack of a better name, or a specific name. Could they, and I agree that Babble Dab District should do more than Babble Dab District is doing because they're doing so little. Most agencies, I've said this before, most responsible managers are trying to do as much of this as they can afford anyway because it's just the smart thing to do. But let's assume that they're there. I think one of the concerns on Met's part is that it doesn't have plenary control over every single one of its members, Lord knows. Wishes it did, but it doesn't. And they don't want to be held hostage to everything else they're doing. And Babble Dab loves the idea of being able to hold Met hostage. So they're worried about this opportunity for, I think in some of the statutes, it's called mischief. So is one way that, can you write an example that gives Met comfort that their lowest common denominator isn't going to control them when in fact they're one of the better actors overall? And I think that's the concern. I haven't quite heard the answer there. I mean, one way to do it, as I read this language, as me being a lawyer, is if they had a proposal that said any water that we're getting through this action, none of it's going to Babble Dab. It's going to go to our other member agencies. That would seem to get them out of this. But I actually think we need more clarity or comfort to people that they're not going to. That's what they're afraid of, this worst case scenario. So we need to figure out how to give comfort on that worst case scenario. I'm not sure the word region works. I'm looking for something that gives that comfort even with the language you've proposed.
I agree. That's what we were hoping to do with examples, but maybe there is other language. Clearly, in my view, it's not. I don't think that Metropolitan, we'll use Met as an example here, if they are doing a transfer and one of their agencies was not compliant, the way the policy is written on its face, you'd have to demonstrate that that agency is the cause for, or a significant part of the cause for them having to take that action.
Yeah, that's where I have read this too. It's like in the example you gave, if the reason Met has to do this, to take this action, is because Babble Dab's not doing what they should be, or that their failure to do what they should be is a significant cause of Met having to do it. Well, yeah, that's the action you do want to look at. If what Met's doing is they're doing business as usual, and yeah, they got a couple actors that aren't perfect, but their poor performance isn't what's behind Met's need to do the project, then this policy shouldn't be a problem.
Well, I think we're going to need to be even clearer because you guys may be close enough to it. I just think I see where the fears are in the language. I just think we need to work a little harder at it. But where I'm disagreeing with Gloria is just I'm not sure that this proposal makes it better. It makes it more obscure, and I'm trying to make it a finer thing. And I mean no disrespect to Babble Dab, which is a wonderful island in Palau, just so you know, that I'm very fond of. But I don't know why that name came to mind. They're good actors most of the time.
So what you're requesting, and I'm going to try and summarize this because I've heard from Ms. Gray, I've heard from you, is some options that might in fact give more. So besides the ones that are already on the table that have been passed out, maybe another option that gives more comfort but doesn't change the fundamental direction of the policy.
But my option would be the one that I spoke of.
Right, I understand.
Mr. Nordhoff.
I just want to say how impressed I am with this language. I mean, this is the sixth iteration. It's been done by committee and staff. I think it's terrific. I think it's clear. And I think it's basically what this group is supposed to be doing: conservation, water efficiency, productivity. I don't find it sinister or negative or threatening at all. I mean, this is very consistent with the mission here. And if we are going to move to the next point, I'd just like to point out for the staff that footnote number 18, the first word in the penultimate sentence should be that instead of that.
Chairman,